Welcome to Advent Conversations with Good Samaritan Church in Pinellas Park, Florida. Jeremy and Ralph, thanks for being with us today. And today we are talking about Joseph, Jesus' father. And John Shelby Spong has this pretty interesting take on Jesus' relationship with his father. He says Jesus must have had a pretty fabulous relationship with his adoptive dad for him to later call or refer to God as our Father, Abba. And most people who've had a messed up relationship with their dad, they have trouble referring to God as our Father because of that. So the fact that Jesus does might very well mean that he had a very good relationship with Joseph, or maybe, it's also possible, I suppose, that Jesus had such a difficult relationship with Joseph that he decided to strip Joseph of the title father and give it to God instead. So let's talk about Joseph. Who is Joseph?
Well, I don't think he necessarily stripped his father of that term, of that, that designation. And when he talks about our Father, he specifically indicates that it's our Father in heaven, in contrast to our Father on earth.
Yeah, I think Spong's take on it would be the way I would lean as well, that he probably had a very good relationship with Joseph.
Right.
This is why he is so able to refer to God in such a intimate kind of way.
Yeah.
Abba, Daddy,
Yeah.
Father. So what else do we know about Joseph? Who is he?
Well, you could say that there's a lot we don't know about him.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting that at the time, Luke tells us that Jesus was about 30 years old when he began his ministry, and it seems that Joseph is not on the scene anymore. I mean, he's not mentioned. When Jesus's family is mentioned, it's his mother and brothers and sisters. When nothing is said of his father, so maybe that his father was older and died before Jesus reached that point in his life when he began his ministry. We don't really know. In Luke's gospel, when he goes back to his hometown in Nazareth, in Matthew and Luke, it occurs in both gospels, but in Matthew, it simply says when Jesus gets through whatever he's doing to heal and teach and so on, they say, well, who is this? I mean, isn't he the carpenter's son? So he's not really named, but he's referred to as carpenter, which is an interesting translation, actually, because the term in Greek is teknon, which is probably translated in several different ways. Could be a carpenter, could be a stonemason, could be a fashioner. It's interesting, we get that word teknon from the Greek and apply it to the tectonic plates that are underlay the continents and so on, and that move around. So, but in Greek it can be translated in several ways. It's interesting, in the Roman Catholic Church, Joseph is indicated as the patron saint of workers, which is probably the best generic term to use for teknon. And so he was some kind of a worker. He may have been a stonemason, and in fact, Zephyrus, which is only like 4 miles away from Nazareth, was a very industrious city where there are a lot of huge monumental buildings constructed. And it may be that Joseph was a stonemason helping to construct those, and maybe even Jesus, helped him as he was growing up, assuming some leadership responsibility.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. Yeah, we all hear carpenter all the time. Yeah, that generic, just, he was a worker.
Exactly.
Well, now, is the engagement between Mary and Joseph, is that like we have today? what did it mean that Joseph was engaged to Mary in that culture, in that time and place?
I'm not sure if in that culture that if it was like kind of arranged marriages or not. I'm not clear on that. But something tells me that it wasn't this kind of courtship where they, saw each other across the crowded room and eyes met and then they dated. And I don't think something doesn't seem like that's what it would be.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Jeremy. It was the culture. In fact, if you haven't seen the movie Fiddler on the Roof, I recommend that you see it. It's because it does give a good view of Jewish culture, Hebrew culture. Because one of the songs in there is "Matchmaker, Find Me a Match," which is a beautiful song. So they did rely upon matchmakers to to find spouses.
Yeah, this was an arranged um, marriage, and probably, you know, we believe Mary was a teenager, but probably she had been betrothed to Joseph for a long time, maybe even most of her life. An
Well, in
arrangement
fact,
between their families.
yeah, it could have been that, for instance, uh, someone, a brother of Joseph, may have been married to a relative of Mary, and he then became like the next one to take the responsibility for her if his brother died. So that would explain maybe why he was old, if he were indeed older. That would explain it.
Well, at first, right, Joseph is not going to go through with his marriage. He's going to break things off with Mary when he first finds out that she's pregnant. Why did he not? And what would have happened to Mary if he hadn't decided to stick by her?
Well, in that culture, I mean, she could have literally, because of adultery, she could have been stoned to death. I mean, her life was on the line had he said, kind of washed his hands and said, this isn't my child, and I don't want any part of this. At the very least, she would be deemed in that community as, I hate this term, but kind of used goods. Like she was not, because women in that culture in biblical times are definitely more of kind of a commodity. And so that, her value would have gone down. And it would have been a really difficult life for her to try to figure out how to survive.
Well said, Jeremy. Well said, because in fact, there are cultures today where if a woman is found pregnant, she's killed. I mean, it's and the family feels either an obligation to kill her or to shun her completely and throw her out into the streets, and she ends up becoming a prostitute in order to live. That's well said, Jeremy. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. So without kind of Joseph stepping up to the plate and in that culture, if you didn't have a male relative or spouse or brother to speak for you and claim you and protect you and care for you and provide for you, it was pretty hard to get by. And so Joseph does this, and because of that, we've been doing some segments on all the women that are named in Matthew's lineage of Jesus, and many of them are sex workers or engaged in these kind of sex scandals. But Joseph decides to stick with Mary, and so that fate that you just described doesn't become Mary's fate.
Ralph, that makes more sense when you said that there's a possibly Mary, that there's like kind of a connection between Joseph and Mary and their families, possibly brother and that kind of mixture. Because it seems like that also there's an extra layer of, what would be in his heart. Why would he want to step into that kind of a mess? But maybe because there's a connection, that there's a family, a familial relation, that's what you do, is you protect your own and the people that you have come to love.
And of course, he had a dream, and that made a big difference.
That helped.
Yeah, so that's why he ends up staying. He has a dream. The way the story describes it, it's this kind of heavenly messenger who comes to him and encourages him to stay and to raise his child as his own, whether we believe that's how it happened or if it was a revelation of some sort. But for whatever reason, he decides to stay.
I think that's one of the beautiful things about it is, that he had that vision, and I really admire and look with great respect for people that have had visions. I mean, for instance, you look back in history in the Roman Catholic Church, you have Saint Teresa of Avila, who had a vision of an angel. In fact, it's been made into a statue in a church in Rome. Beautiful image. And a lot of people in the Muslim faith have had visions like that too. And I admire people that have those. I've never experienced one, but I have great respect for those who have.
Ralph, I've been so surprised. Some of us write that kind of thing off as unintellectual or fantasy of some sort. But gosh, I've met some people who, even professors in seminary, who would describe these visions, and sometimes people are hesitant to talk about them. But a lot of the really deeply spiritual people in our world have had these mystical experiences.
Yeah. And I really admire that. Yeah.
Now, being an unfaithful, being a faithful spouse to an unfaithful spouse, that's imagery that's been used in the Bible before. And I'm thinking particularly of the book of Hosea. How do we hear echoes of the book of Hosea in the Christmas story?
Well, that's an interesting connection. I hadn't really thought about that before, but it is true that Hosea married a prostitute. Gomer was a prostitute, and a lot of the prophets did some very strange things to illustrate or to give some kind of an impact to their prophecy, their proclamations, and their preachings, and so on. And this became a kind of a model that he wanted to demonstrate to people how they had become unfaithful to God, but he was nevertheless faithful to them.
Right.
That's kind of the message of Hosea. And in fact, Matthew quotes Hosea when he talks about the fact that Jesus and his family went down to Egypt, and he says, out of Egypt I've called my son, which is right out of chapter 11 of the book of Hosea. And of course, Hosea had something totally different in mind when he said that. He was talking about his son being the people of Israel, and
right.
He wasn't really thinking about Jesus, but Matthew picked up on that and said, "Yeah, this is about Jesus."
Yeah. So Hosea, taken as an actual story of a family, it's this kind of bizarre story. He names the child that he and Gomer have what basically translates as "not my people."
Right.
Gosh, I can't imagine naming my child "not my people." But it's all symbolic of God's relationship with the Hebrew people. And, we have these cycles throughout the Hebrew scriptures of they're faithful and then they fall away from faithfulness, and God loves them anyways and holds them in that covenant relationship. And there's redemption and restoration, and they go through that cycle over and over. With that underlying theme throughout the Hebrew scriptures, God is faithful even when we're not. Well, do we hear echoes in this story of Joseph? Remember, Joseph is Jacob and Rachel's son in the Hebrew scriptures. Do we hear echoes of that character in the Christmas story?
You mean echoes of Joseph, who rescued his people from and was second only to the Pharaoh in Egypt? Is that the Joseph you mean?
Yes, as the musical puts it, Joseph in the Technicolor coat. Right?
Yes, right.
Yeah, that Joseph. Do we hear
Yeah,
the echoes of him in Joseph, Jesus' father?
I guess in a way you can hear that because if it were not for him, you don't know what it would have happened to Mary and of course Jesus at that point. So he was kind of a savior of his people too,
Mm.
in a way. Yeah.
I think the clearest point of connection probably is that Joseph was known as being a dreamer, right?
Yeah,
And having
right.
these
Exactly.
dreams that he followed, that guided him, and ultimately, guided him to tell Pharaoh to put away food. And then when there was famine in the land and his own family members came to Egypt looking for food, he had food to offer them. And so
Yeah.
following his dreams ultimately was what saved his people. And we're going to see that in Joseph, Jesus' father, as well.
Well, that's beautifully put. Yeah, because Joseph followed his dream as well.
Mm-hmm.
That's beautifully put. Yeah, I like that.
Yeah, Joseph listens, and not just to the first dream, right, to stick by Mary, but also to the dream to get up and leave and go to Egypt and then to come back from Egypt, right? He's
Right. Yeah.
listening. He's this character who's deeply tuned in to God, and seems to have this very kind of close connection with God, such that he senses what's needed to save his people, to save his family.
Yeah.
Well, why does Joseph, I mean, we mentioned the dreams. Is there any other reason that you can think of why Joseph ultimately stays with Mary and raises this child as his own?
I think, like you mentioned, I think Joseph trusts in God, trusts in these dreams, trusts when God comes to him that God knows best, and can see and can feel a bigger picture, that it's not just his little family, that this is something larger. I mean, this is the Messiah.
Well, why do you think it's important that adoption is part of Jesus' story?
I think is beautiful. Personally, from in my family, my niece is adopted. So adoption is just near and dear to my heart. And I love that it's represented in this birth narrative, because it really is a testament that, families come together in all shapes and sizes and ways, and how we find each other and how we love one another. And it does not have to be one way, that there is, multivocality to what a family is.
Yeah,
Thanks.
that's beautifully said, Jeremy. And plus, also, the fact of the matter is that we are all just adopted. We're
Yeah.
not, we don't have any we're not descended from God. We're all adopted. So that makes good sense to me.
Well, thank you both for this wonderful conversation on Joseph. Thank you for joining us for Advent Conversations as we continue on the journey of this season.